Video games seem to be in the news more than ever recently, and it seems that it's rarely for positive reasons. In the aftermath of globally reported tragedies, such as the horrific Sandy Hook school shootings, in which 27 schoolchildren and their teachers were senselessly murdered, or the Columbine High School massacre in Colorado, where 13 victims were tragically killed by 2 fellow students, it seems that the political and media focus placed on video games is never too far behind. This attention tends to spotlight the apparent influence that games have on perpetrators of tragedies like this, or the impact that they might have on impressionable children. Essentially, in the continued quest to explain the unexplainable, video games have become a prominent target from sources worldwide as a negative, malignant influence on the younger generations. In fact, there is so much vociferous attention given to castigating games these days, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this is a relatively recent trend, the info concern for the media if you will, yet really, video game controversies have actually been around for pretty much as long as games themselves. Now, in upcoming videos, I do plan to dig into the root of the actual psychology behind violence in games and what the current research has actually found. Spoilers, it turns out we don't have too much to worry about. But before we do that, I thought it was important to build some context and have a look at all of the times that games have actually wound everybody right up through the years. Now, not all controversies are created equally. When I say controversy, I don't just mean I bought SimCity and it won't connect to the server sort of controversies, or the ending to Mass Effect 3 was shit sort of controversies, or hang on, the paid DLC's already on the disc sort of nonsense. I mean good old fashioned, video games are fucking evil and they're corrupting our kids sort of controversies. That said, I'm not going to give any real attention to the pandering, try-hard, false bollocks like Super Columbine RPG or ethnic cleansing because, well, they should be quite rightfully derided as base level dog shit. So, on that lovely note,
it starts right now!
With the arcade scene exploding the world over, the late 70s signalled the beginning of what is considered by many to be the golden age of video games, with perhaps none being more famous than the 1978 hit Space Invaders, a game often credited as continuing what the likes of Pong had started years before. Yet, somehow games had already managed to piss people off a whole 2 years earlier, with Exidy's 1976 effort Death Race, an arcade game based on the then recently released David Carradine cult classic Death Race 2000. You know, the one with Sly Stallone delivering one of the most objectively beautiful lines in cinematic history.
You know, Myra, some people might think you're cute, but me, I think you're one very large baked potato.
The game was a simple affair in which the sole task was to run down fleeing stick figures in your car whilst avoiding the gravestones their corpses left behind. The game caused a public outcry regarding its violent themes, and it even appeared on CBS news show 60 Minutes. A special focus was given to how the hapless victims would scream in apparent pain as they were run over, but Exidy countered this outcry by insisting the victims weren't people at all, and they were in fact gremlins. Because, well, obviously nobody gives a shit about violence just as long as it's a gremlin getting fucked over. Inevitably, Exidy had the last laugh as the controversy did little more than significantly bolster the popularity of Death Race, and it would even get an NES remake almost 15 years later. Game creator Howell Ivey even admitted in a 2014 interview with Retro Gamer that the Gremlins excuse was of course complete and utter bollocks, and they were supposed to be people after all, the cheeky old sod. One thing was for certain though, video game controversies were here to stay.
Well, if you look at what they represent, raping, racism, violence, pornography, militarism, all the worst kinds of things in society which we would like to eliminate. So I think that they're very detrimental.
Fast forward then to 1982, and with games quickly becoming more prominent in households rather than just arcades, controversy was once again not too far behind, not least down to the emergence of so-called adult video games, which often centred around pornographic themes. Enter creators Mystique, who very shrewdly realised that there was a glaring and inexplicable absence in the market for rape simulators set during historical battles, and so with that in mind quickly released Custer's Revenge for the Atari 2600. The game had you play as real-life US Civil War figure General George Custer, of course most famous for the battle in which he lost his life, known today as Custer's Last Stand. However, the Atari game bizarrely had literally nothing to do with 19th century Native American conflicts, and instead was an asinine and deliberately crude game that required you to dodge falling arrows so that Custer could reach his goal, which was in this case to rape a Native American woman bound to a cactus. Understandably, people were absolutely outraged at the content of the game, including this man who shared his feelings in a live news interview.
The graphics aren't bad.
Almost single-handedly, Custer's Revenge brought a great deal of scrutiny upon video games as an entire industry, with calls for not only the game to be boycotted and pulled from stores, but also for stricter rules to be imposed on the content of games in general. Part of the problem was that in these nascent days of home video games, licensing laws weren't as robust as they are today. These days, if a developer wants to make a game for the PlayStation 4, they have to be granted permission by Sony and are subject to follow certain guidelines. It's incredible to think now, but in the early 80s this was not the case, and anybody with the means and ability to create a game could put it out on the console without any influence from Atari themselves. Ironically, not only was this part of the reason that enabled games like Custer's Revenge to exist in the first place, but it's also the reason why the controversy eventually died down. Less than a year after the game was released, the games industry completely crashed in the US, with the main reason being an overwhelming saturation of the market, since there was almost no quality control or information for consumers to make a judgment. So for most of the video games industry, that pretty much meant... Unsurprisingly, Mystique went out of business during the crash, although a Phoenix company called PlayAround did try to carry on where they had left off. There was even a follow-up to Custer's Revenge called General Retreat, a lazy cash-in where the game was almost identical, other than the fact that Custer and the woman had swapped roles, so arguably if anybody got revenge it was her. At this point though, even good games are struggling to stay relevant with consumers, so essentially, well, nobody really gave a shit. But it wasn't just the West that were having problems with content in video games. In 1986, Japan quite rightly went apeshit at the release of PC-88 game 177. Similar in premise to Custer's Revenge, but without the misplaced cartoon slapstick, 177 was an incredibly bleak game in which you had to rip clothes off a terrified girl as she fled home, with the player eventually tackling her to the ground and raping her. Incredibly, the game was even unashamedly brazen enough to take its title from the Japanese legal code for sexual assault. 177 was eventually pulled from shelves, but not without creating a platform for what would become a niche genre in Japanese video games, a theme that has somehow continued into the modern day with games such as the highly controversial Rape Play. One thing was for sure though, although the 80s were just ending, the controversies were just getting started.
Prepare for unforeseen consequences.
Next time, we'll focus on the 1990s and how two games in particular caused such controversy it literally changed how games would be viewed as entertainment forever. Until then, we'll just have to hope games don't manage to piss anybody off in the meantime. I'm really not sure I could keep up.